Imagine a world where your word was your bond, but no words were even spoken. A world where a simple handshake could decide the fate of empires, where breaking bread together forged unbreakable alliances, and where silent gestures held more authority than any written decree. This isn't a fantasy, it's how human societies functioned for thousands of years, long before contracts were filled with fine print and legal jargon. We're about to step into that world, a realm of profound trust and powerful symbolism, where agreements weren't signed but felt, witnessed, and lived. Throughout history, across cultures and continents, people developed astonishing ways to make promises without uttering a single syllable. They used hands, objects, rituals, and even the world around them to create binding pacts that governed everything from daily trade to international peace. These weren't casual understandings, they were serious contracts backed by honor, tradition, and often the divine. In this video, we're going to uncover 32 of these incredible non-verbal agreements, each one a masterpiece of human ingenuity and connection. You'll see how a shared drink could prevent wars, how an exchanged glance could seal a lifelong partnership, and how something as simple as a stone or a piece of cloth could carry the weight of 1,000 words. What's truly remarkable is how many of these ancient practices still echo in our lives today. That handshake you offer at the end of a job interview. It has roots stretching back millennia. The toast you raise at a wedding, it once meant far more than just celebration. By exploring these silent contracts, we're not just looking at history, we're rediscovering a universal language of trust that transcends time and culture. So settle in and open your mind, because we're about to journey through the hidden architecture of human agreement, and you may never look at a simple gesture the same way again. Think about the very first agreements humans ever made. There were no lawyers, no written terms, not even a common language to rely on. In this world, your actions had to speak louder than words, and they had to speak with absolute clarity. This was the birthplace of non-verbal contracts. These silent pacts didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were a brilliant, necessary adaptation to the challenges of early human society. In small, close-knit communities where everyone knew each other, a person's reputation was their most valuable asset. A broken promise wouldn't just be forgotten. It would be remembered and could isolate you from the group you depended on for survival. This immense social pressure made a simple gesture, witnessed by the community, as binding as any legal document is today. The methods they developed were deeply rooted in the realities of their daily lives. Consider the earliest farmers. Their survival depended on cooperation. Helping a neighbor build a barn or harvest crops created an unspoken agreement that the favor would be returned. This was a contract sealed not with a signature, but with shared labor and sweat. Similarly, the act of sharing a meal, of offering your limited food to a visitor, was a powerful pact of hospitality and protection. You were literally offering a part of your life's sustenance, and to violate that trust was to violate a fundamental law of humanity. These practices were universal because the needs they addressed were universal. The need for security, for cooperation, and for trust that extended beyond your immediate family. As societies grew larger and more complex, encountering strangers and different tribes, the need for reliable agreements became even more critical. How could you make a deal with someone whose language you didn't speak? How could you promise peace to a group you didn't fully understand? This is where symbolism became a universal language. A handshake showed you carried no weapon. Sharing salt, a precious commodity essential for preserving life, demonstrated goodwill and a commitment to preserving the relationship. These symbolic acts transcended linguistic and cultural barriers. They created a shared moment of understanding that was far more difficult to misinterpret or later deny than a spoken promise. The symbolism was often reinforced by invoking higher powers, a gesture toward the sky, a hand on a sacred stone, making the agreement not just between people, but between their gods, adding a powerful layer of spiritual enforcement that helped maintain order and trust across vast and diverse empires. But why did these gestures carry such immense power? The answer lies in their deep symbolic meaning, which turned simple actions into profound commitments. Think of symbolism as the universal language long before dictionaries or translators existed. A clenched fist wasn't just a physical gesture, it represented solidarity, strength, and an unbreakable promise. When two people shared a drink, they weren't merely quenching thirst, they were blending their intentions, symbolically internalizing the same purpose. These symbols worked because they tapped into shared cultural stories and beliefs that everyone understood. In ancient Egypt, for instance, an agreement might be sealed by presenting a small ankh symbol, representing life itself, implying that the pact was vital and enduring. Similarly, many Native American tribes used the exchange of a peace pipe, where the smoke rising to the heavens carried their vows to the spirits, making the agreement sacred and watched by higher powers. This symbolic layer added a gravity that mere words often lacked. Consider the practice of spitting into one's palm before a handshake, common in some parts of Europe well into the modern era. On the surface, it might seem strange, but its meaning was crystal clear to those involved. Saliva was believed to carry a part of one's essence or soul, so by mixing it in a handshake, you were literally blending your spirit with the other person's, creating a bond that was meant to be as permanent as life itself. It was a way of saying, I am putting my very being into this promise. This kind of symbolism made contracts incredibly resilient. You couldn't simply take back your word because your word wasn't just spoken, it was physically enacted and spiritually witnessed. The symbol itself became a tangible anchor for the agreement, something that could be remembered, referenced, and respected long after the moment had passed. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of this symbolic language was its ability to cross boundaries. A trader from Mesopotamia could meet a chieftain from the Indus Valley, and without speaking a word of each other's language, they could negotiate a deal using gestures, objects, and actions whose meanings were universally grasped. The offering of a weapon, hilt first, signaled peaceful intentions across countless cultures. The sharing of salt, a precious commodity essential for preserving life, became a near-universal symbol of preservation and goodwill between parties. This created a framework for interaction that was both flexible and reliable, allowing for commerce, diplomacy, and cultural exchange on a scale that would have been impossible without this shared, silent vocabulary. It demonstrated a profound understanding of human psychology, that a powerful image or action could communicate complex ideas more effectively than a sentence that might be misheard, forgotten, or deliberately twisted. The symbol was the contract, and its meaning was upheld by the collective understanding of entire societies. Now let's meet the first and perhaps most familiar character in our story of silent agreements, the handshake. This simple act of clasping right hands feels so natural to us today that we rarely pause to consider its ancient origins and profound meaning. But in the world of non-verbal contracts, the handshake stands as a towering achievement, a gesture that has bridged cultures and centuries with its elegant simplicity. Its story begins not in corporate boardrooms, but in the sun-drenched agora of ancient Greece, where philosophers debated and merchants traded under the Mediterranean sun. Here, the handshake emerged as something far more significant than a casual greeting. It represented nothing less than the meeting of two minds in perfect agreement. Picture two Greek merchants from rival city-states meeting for the first time. They speak different dialects, worship different gods, and approach business with different customs. How can they possibly establish enough trust to exchange valuable goods? The answer lies in their right hands. By extending their empty weapon hands and clasping palms, they perform a powerful pantomime of peace. The open palm shows they carry no dagger, no hidden blade, no intention to harm. The firm grip demonstrates strength and sincerity. This is no fleeting touch but a meaningful connection. In that moment, their handshake says what words cannot. I come in peace, I offer respect, and I pledge my honor to this agreement. This was especially crucial in a society where carrying weapons was common, and distrust between strangers was the default assumption. The physical nature of the Handshake Pact cannot be overstated. Unlike a spoken promise that vanishes into the air, the handshake creates a tangible connection that both parties feel in their bodies. The pressure of the grip, the warmth of the palm, the duration of the hold, all these elements communicated subtle nuances about the agreement's seriousness and the individual's sincerity. This physical reinforcement made the contract memorable and emotionally resonant. You might forget the exact words spoken during a negotiation, but you would remember the firm handshake that sealed the deal. This tactile element also created a moment of mutual vulnerability, as both parties had to trust each other enough to bring their hands together without fear of attack or trickery. What's truly remarkable about the Handshake Pact is how it established equality between the parties. In societies with rigid social hierarchies, most interactions reinforced differences in status. But the handshake, by its very nature, required both participants to meet as equals. A king shaking hands with a common merchant, a general with a foot soldier. In that moment, their social distinctions momentarily faded as their palms met in mutual agreement. This temporary equality was essential for creating contracts that both parties felt obligated to honor, regardless of their usual social positions. The handshake said, "For the purposes of this agreement, we stand as equals, bound by the same rules of honor." The consequences of breaking a handshake pact were severe and lasting. In ancient Greek society, where personal honor was intertwined with public reputation, violating a handshake agreement could destroy a person's standing in the community. The offended party might spread word of the betrayal, making others hesitant to deal with the oath breaker. In some cases, these broken agreements sparked generations-long feuds between families or city-states, with the original handshake betrayal remembered as the cause. This social enforcement mechanism made the handshake incredibly effective. The risk of dishonor was often a stronger deterrent than any legal penalty could be. The handshake's power came not from written laws but from the unwritten codes of honor that governed ancient societies. This ancient practice has shown astonishing resilience, surviving the rise and fall of empires, the development of complex legal systems, and the digital transformation of modern life. Even today, when we have contracts that run to hundreds of pages and electronic signatures that can be applied from across the globe, we still seal our most important agreements with a handshake. CEOs use it to finalize mergers, politicians use it to signal diplomatic breakthroughs, and ordinary people use it to confirm everything from job offers to house purchases. Its endurance speaks to a fundamental human truth. We still crave that physical, personal connection that says more than any document ever could. The handshake remains our most immediate way to look someone in the eye and say, "You have my word," connecting us directly to those ancient Greek merchants who understood that trust begins with an open hand. Now, if the handshake was the universal language of agreement, then salt was its most sacred currency. Imagine a substance so vital to human survival that it could preserve food, heal wounds, and season meals, a true luxury in the ancient world. This wasn't just a seasoning, it was life itself, and because of its immense value, sharing it became one of the most serious contracts a person could ever enter. This was the Salt Covenant, a pact where a pinch of crystals could bind souls more powerfully than any written oath. To understand its gravity, we have to step away from our modern world, where salt is cheap and plentiful, and into an era where it was literally worth its weight in gold. In those times, offering someone your salt wasn't just being generous. It was offering them a piece of your security, your wealth, and your future. The symbolism here runs incredibly deep. Salt doesn't just make food taste better, it prevents decay. It preserves meat through harsh winters, it heals by cleaning wounds, and it was even believed to ward off evil spirits in many cultures. So when you shared salt with someone, you weren't just sharing a meal, you were sharing preservation. You were symbolically saying, I will help preserve your life, and you will preserve mine. This created a bond of mutual survival that was almost impossible to break. In the Middle East, this practice was particularly formalized. The Bedouin tribes of the Arabian desert, for whom hospitality was a supreme virtue, had a powerful tradition. When a traveler was invited into a tent and offered food seasoned with the host's salt, an immediate and unbreakable covenant was formed. That traveler, even if they were from a rival tribe, was now under the host's absolute protection. To harm a guest after sharing salt was considered an abomination, a violation of a sacred trust that would bring shame upon the entire family or tribe. This concept of salt creating a bond of loyalty echoes through history and even into religious texts. In the Bible, it's referred to as a covenant of salt, signifying a permanent and unbreakable pact between God and his people. In ancient Rome, soldiers were sometimes paid in salt. This is where we get the word salary, and this payment wasn't just wages, it was a covenant of loyalty. The salt represented the empire's commitment to preserve the soldier's life through payment, and in return, the soldier pledged his service. The consequences of breaking a salt covenant were severe and social. If you betrayed someone after sharing salt, you weren't just breaking a promise, you were violating a sacred bond. The punishment was often exile or ostracism. Your community would shun you because you had proven yourself untrustworthy in the most fundamental way. Your name would become synonymous with betrayal, making it impossible for anyone to ever enter into an agreement with you again. This wasn't about laws or courts, it was about honor, and honor was the glue that held these ancient societies together. What's fascinating is how this ancient contract reveals a universal human truth. We use the value systems we understand to formalize our relationships. In a world where salt was precious, it became the medium for a promise. Today, we might sign a contract on a piece of paper, which is valuable because of the legal system that backs it. But in the ancient world, the value was inherent in the object itself. The Salt Covenant shows us that contract law didn't begin in courtrooms. It began around dinner tables with people using the most valuable things they had to say. You can trust me. It was a tangible, edible, life-giving proof of a promise that went deeper than words ever could. After the profound commitment of sharing salt, ancient societies elevated this concept of hospitality into an even more universal and powerful ritual: the breaking of bread. If salt was the sacred currency of preservation, then bread was the very essence of life, the fundamental sustenance that separated survival from starvation. To break bread with someone was to perform a sacred act of community, a silent declaration that said, "My life is now shared with yours." This contract was woven into the fabric of countless cultures, from the nomadic tribes of the Arabian desert to the philosophical courts of ancient China, creating an invisible shield of protection around anyone who partook of another's food. The power of this pact lay in its beautiful, simple symbolism. bread in its countless forms was the ultimate product of human labor and nature's generosity. It required sowing seeds, tending crops, harvesting grain, grinding flour, and baking a long chain of effort that culminated in a food that could sustain a family. To offer this to a stranger was to offer them the fruits of your land and your labor. You weren't just giving them a meal, you were sharing the very foundation of your existence. In the ancient Greek world, this idea was so central that they had a specific god, Zeus Xenios, dedicated to protecting the sacred relationship between host and guest. The act of sharing a meal created a xenia, a bond of guest friendship that was considered absolutely inviolable. A traveler who ate at your table was instantly transformed from a potential threat into an honored guest, entitled to your protection, your resources, and your aid for their journey ahead. This tradition was perhaps most fiercely upheld in the harsh environment of the desert, where survival was a daily struggle. For the Bedouin people, the laws of hospitality were the highest laws of the land. A traveler lost in the dunes could approach any tent, and by custom they would be welcomed, fed, and sheltered for 3 days without even being asked their name. The host's duty was to provide, and the guest's duty was to accept with grace and offer no harm. This system was a brilliant social safety net, ensuring that no one would perish from hunger or exposure in an unforgiving landscape. The shared meal, often a simple loaf of flatbread and a bowl of stew, was the physical seal on this life-saving contract. To betray this trust was almost unimaginable. Harming a guest after breaking bread wasn't just murder, it was a sacrilege that would bring eternal shame upon the perpetrator and their entire lineage. The belief in divine enforcement of this contract was nearly universal. In Norse mythology, the god Loki is ultimately punished for his many crimes, but one of his most grievous sins was killing a fellow god while disguised as a guest at a feast, a violation of the sacred bond of hospitality. In Hindu traditions, the ancient texts proclaim that a guest is equivalent to a god and must be treated as such. The fear of divine retribution was a powerful psychological deterrent, ensuring that even in the absence of written laws or police forces, this non-verbal contract was rarely broken. The shared meal created a temporary kinship, a bond that was meant to be as nurturing and life-giving as the food itself. It was a promise carved not in stone, but consumed into the very bodies of the participants, making the agreement a part of them. This ancient understanding that the table is a place of truce and food is a language of peace still resonates with us today, whether we're sealing a business deal over lunch or welcoming a new neighbor with a home-cooked meal. But if sharing food created a bond of mutual survival, then the exchange of gifts built something even more complex and enduring, a web of social obligation that could span generations. This was never about simple charity or spontaneous generosity. In the ancient world, a gift was a social atom, charged with potential energy, setting in motion an unspoken but deeply understood cycle of reciprocity. To accept a gift was to accept a debt, and that debt wasn't measured in currency but in loyalty, support, or a future favor of equal symbolic weight. This transformed a material object into a powerful non-verbal contract, a silent promise that bound people together in a dance of mutual obligation. We see this system operating with brilliant clarity in the oldest stories we have, like Homer's Iliad. In the midst of the brutal Trojan War, two bitter enemies, the Greek Diomes and the Trojan Glaucus, meet on the battlefield. Just before they clash, they discover their grandfathers had been guest friends, bound by the sacred ties of hospitality and gift exchange. Immediately, the dynamic shifts. They cannot fight. Instead, they leap from their chariots, clasp hands, and decide to exchange armor. This isn't a random act of sportsmanship, it's a ritual. By exchanging gifts, they are renewing the contract between their families, effectively saying, "Our bond is stronger than this war." The pact is sealed not with a document, but with the physical transfer of gleaming bronze and gold. Homer even notes with a touch of irony that Glaucus got the far worse end of the deal, trading his gold armor for Diome's bronze, 100 oxen's worth for 9. But the value was irrelevant, the act itself was everything. It was a public performance of an ancient agreement that overrode even the immediate command to kill one another. The gifts themselves were never arbitrary. They were dense with symbolic meaning, carefully chosen to communicate a specific message. A finely crafted sword given by a king to a warrior wasn't just a reward, it was a contract. The sword symbolized the king's power and his expectation that the warrior would use that very weapon to defend him. A woven tapestry given in a diplomatic marriage wasn't just a beautiful object. It told a story, often of the bride's homeland, and represented the weaving together of two families or even two nations. The gift carried the identity of the giver, and in accepting it, the receiver acknowledged a connection to that identity. This is why the phrase, "to look a gift horse in the mouth," was considered the height of bad manners. It wasn't just ungrateful, it was suspicious. It implied you were assessing the literal value of the gift rather than honoring the symbolic bond it was meant to create, effectively questioning the sincerity of the entire contract. The stakes of this ritual were incredibly high, making gift-giving a tense and carefully negotiated affair. Failure to reciprocate appropriately wasn't just an embarrassment, it could be a casus belli, a reason for war. If a chieftain sent another a herd of prized horses and received only a few bolts of cloth in return, it was a devastating insult. The message was clear: "I do not value our relationship as highly as you do, or worse, I consider you my inferior." This could shatter alliances and ignite long-standing feuds. Conversely, offering a gift that was too extravagant could also be dangerous, as it placed an impossibly heavy burden of debt on the receiver, potentially forcing them into a position of subservience. Every exchange was a subtle communication of power, status, and intention, a non-verbal dialogue conducted through objects. This intricate system of gift exchange formed the invisible architecture of ancient diplomacy, trade, and social hierarchy, proving that sometimes the most binding contracts are those that are never written down but are constantly being repaid. Now imagine a marketplace with no haggling voices, no shared language, and no face-to-face meetings, a commercial exchange conducted in complete silence. This was the reality of the silent trade system, one of the most ingenious and trust-based contracts ever devised. It flourished in the spaces between worlds, where different cultures met not with words, but with actions, building bridges of commerce across chasms of mutual suspicion. This system didn't just facilitate trade. It was a brilliant psychological protocol designed to minimize conflict and maximize fairness through a carefully choreographed dance of departure and return. The mechanics were beautifully simple, yet they required immense discipline from both parties. One group, often nomadic traders or merchants from a more centralized civilization, would arrive at a pre-established neutral zone, a riverbank, a clearing in the forest, or a designated beach. They would carefully arrange their goods, perhaps bolts of fine cloth, gleaming metal tools, or bags of salt, and then retreat to a safe distance, often signaling their departure with a smoke signal or a loud call. Then the second party, usually local inhabitants, would emerge from hiding. They would approach the goods, inspect them meticulously, and then lay down their own proposed items for exchange, maybe ivory, exotic animal skins, or gold dust. They too would then withdraw. The first group would return. If they were satisfied with the counter-offer, they would take it and leave, finalizing the deal. If not, they would retreat once more, signaling the need for a better offer. This would continue until an agreement was reached, all without a single word spoken or the traders ever laying eyes on one another. This practice was remarkably widespread. The cunning Phoenician sailors, some of the ancient world's greatest merchants, used versions of this system when dealing with coastal tribes in places like West Africa who were wary of outsiders. The Greek historian Herodotus described a similar silent trade for gold conducted by the Carthaginians with people living on the Atlantic coast of Africa. But perhaps the most well-documented examples come from the forest regions of Central Africa and among some indigenous groups in Southeast Asia. In Malaysia, for instance, the Orang Asli people historically traded forest products like rattan and incense wood with Malay merchants through this silent method, avoiding direct contact that could lead to misunderstanding or exploitation. The genius of this non-verbal contract lay in its elegant solution to the problem of trust. By eliminating direct contact, it removed the immediate potential for violence that could arise from a misunderstood gesture or a sudden movement. It also leveled the playing field. Neither party could use force or intimidation to sway the deal. The only leverage was the inherent desirability of the goods themselves. The system ran on a powerful, mutual understanding of fair value. Both sides knew that if they tried to cheat, by leaving goods of poor quality or making a ridiculously low counter-offer, the entire trading relationship would collapse. Their reputation and the future income it represented was on the line with every transaction. This enforced honesty became the bedrock of a long-term economic relationship that might continue for generations, all built on a foundation of complete silence. This silent trade system stands as a powerful testament to a universal human truth. Commerce, the desire to exchange and connect, will find a way. Even in the absence of a common language or a basis of trust, humans invented a ritual that allowed value to speak for itself. It was a contract written not on parchment, but in actions, a repeated performance of offer and acceptance that proved our economic impulses are often rooted not in conflict, but in a deep, if silent, cooperation. While the silent trade system built trust across vast distances without any personal contact at all, other ancient contracts sought to magnify the power of an agreement by anchoring it in the most permanent and unyielding substance they knew: stone. In a world where words could be forgotten and loyalties could shift like sand, a stone stood immutable. It was a witness that would not die, forget, or lie. This profound belief gave rise to the oath stone ritual, a practice where a simple rock was transformed into the most solemn courtroom, church, and notary public one could imagine. To lay a hand upon an oath stone was to tether your promise to the eternal, inviting the very earth itself to hold you accountable. The act itself was deceptively simple, but its psychological power was immense. In Norse traditions, a chieftain might call his followers to swear loyalty upon a large, prominent stone, often one that had been in the community for generations. Each man would step forward, place his hand upon the cool, rough surface, and speak his vow aloud. This was far more than a symbolic gesture. The physical connection was everything. In that moment, the permanence of the stone was believed to flow into the promise, making it as steadfast and unbreakable as granite. The stone absorbed the vow, becoming a silent, perpetual keeper of the oath. To break a promise sworn on such an object was to defy not just the person you made it to, but the natural order itself. It was an invitation for the steadfast nature of the stone to turn against you, potentially bringing a curse of instability, misfortune, or ruin upon you and your family. This belief in the stone's active role as an enforcer was a powerful deterrent against betrayal. Location was crucial to the ritual's power. These were not random rocks picked from a field. Oath stones were almost always situated in places already charged with spiritual significance. In Celtic cultures, many were found within ancient stone circles, on burial mounds, or beside sacred wells, places believed to be thin veils between the world of humans and the world of the gods or ancestors. By swearing an oath in such a place, you were amplifying your vow, calling upon every powerful entity in the vicinity to bear witness. A promise made at a crossroads, for instance, invoked the watchfulness of the god who presided over choices and journeys. An oath sworn on a burial mound called upon the ancestors to listen and judge. This layered the contract with multiple levels of spiritual enforcement, making the cost of breaking it astronomically high, both in this world and the next. The stone itself was often seen as the physical anchor for these spirits, the point where their power touched the mortal realm. The legacy of the oath stone is etched into our language and traditions more deeply than we often realize. The concept of a cornerstone or foundation stone for a building project, which we still celebrate today, harkens back to this ancient idea of invoking permanence and stability through stone. In some Scottish traditions, important legal agreements were once finalized by the parties touching a designated stone, transferring the agreement's authority from their fleeting words to the stone's enduring presence. This practice illustrates a fundamental human desire to make our promises outlast our own lifetimes, to find something in the world more permanent than our own intentions to guarantee our word. In an age before mass media or easy record-keeping, the oath stone was a public, permanent, and profoundly spiritual record of a person's word, a contract written not on parchment but on the very landscape, ensuring that some promises were truly set in stone. Yet even the unyielding permanence of the oath stone pales in comparison to the ultimate personal commitment found in the blood brotherhood pact. If other contracts used symbols to represent a bond, this ritual sought to create an actual, physical bond, using the one substance that every culture recognized as the very essence of life itself. This was not an agreement about property or temporary peace. This was a deliberate, irreversible act of creating a new family, forging a kinship that was meant to be stronger than the ties of blood one was born into. It was the most intimate and extreme non-verbal contract imaginable, a silent vow written not with ink but with life force. The ritual itself took many forms, but its core was always the same, the deliberate mixing of blood between two or more individuals. Among the nomadic Scythians of the Eurasian steppes, warriors might slash their arms and press the wounds together, allowing their blood to commingle and drip onto the earth, a potent symbol of their lives now being intertwined. In some Native American tribes, like the Lakota, the ceremony was even more intricate. Participants might prick their skin and add their blood to a sacred pipe, which was then smoked, effectively sharing their life essence through breath and smoke. In other cultures, blood was dripped into a shared cup of wine or water, and then drunk, a literal act of taking the other person into oneself. Each method was a powerful, visceral metaphor. The message was unmistakable. We are no longer two separate beings. My life is in your veins, and yours is in mine. Your survival is now my survival, and your enemy is now my enemy. This contract was the nuclear option of ancient alliances, reserved for the most serious of circumstances. It was often used to permanently end a bloody feud between families or tribes, transforming generations of hatred into an unbreakable bond. It could also be used to solidify a political or military alliance of immense importance, where ordinary promises were deemed insufficient. By becoming blood brothers, leaders were ensuring that their personal fates were so entangled that betrayal would be tantamount to self-destruction. The social weight of this pact was crushing. To betray a blood brother was the ultimate sacrilege, a crime worse than murder. It was seen as a perversion of nature itself, as you were harming a part of your own extended self. The punishment was often exile or death, not just from the betrayed party, but from the entire community, which saw such an act as a threat to the very concept of trust that held society together. What's truly fascinating is how this ancient concept reveals a universal human understanding of biology long before the science existed. Instinctively, cultures around the world recognized blood as the fundamental carrier of life, identity, and heredity. By mixing it, they believed they were mixing their souls, their destinies, and their very characters. This pact left no room for doubt, no room for lawyers, and no room for interpretation. It was the most direct, physical, and terrifyingly permanent contract ever devised, a silent scream of loyalty that echoed through the centuries, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful promises are the ones that are felt in the pulse of your own veins. But if the blood pact merged lives in the most visceral way possible, other cultures developed a far more cerebral, yet equally binding, form of non-verbal contract, one that turned a simple piece of cord into a complex legal document. This was the world of knot-tying agreements, where the intricate language of loops and hitches could dictate terms, record debts, and seal promises with a sophistication that rivals our modern filing systems. In an age without paper, the humble knot became a powerful technology for memory and agreement, transforming a tangible action into an intangible promise. The most breathtaking example of this is undoubtedly the Inca quipu. Imagine an empire stretching thousands of miles down the spine of the Andes, with no written alphabet to administer it. The Inca solved this monumental challenge with an elegant system of knotted cords. A quipu consisted of a main cord from which hung numerous pendant strings of different colors, materials, and lengths. On these strings, a trained official, the quipukamayok, would tie a series of complex knots. The type of knot, its position on the string, the number of turns, and even the direction of the tie each held specific meanings. A decimal system was used for numerical data, allowing the recording of census figures, tax obligations, and storehouse inventories. But the quipu was far more than an abacus. It was a narrative device. Specific knot combinations could represent historical events, record the terms of a treaty between a conquered tribe and the empire, or denote the specific obligations owed by a community, a certain number of bushels of maize, days of labor, or soldiers for the army. The physical quipu itself was the binding contract, a portable, durable record that could be stored and referenced for generations. The act of tying the knot was the ancient equivalent of signing on the dotted line, but with a powerful physical ritual that made the agreement unforgettable. When two parties reached a consensus, a designated knot would be tied, often in the presence of witnesses. This act transformed the abstract terms of the deal into a concrete, tactile object. You could hold the contract in your hands, feel the tightness of the knots, and see the specific pattern that represented your pledge. This physicality made the agreement feel more real and more permanent. Crucially, untying that knot could only be done with mutual consent, symbolizing the dissolution of the pact once its terms were fulfilled. To secretly untie or alter a knot was not just cheating. It was a form of forgery, a violation of a physical truth that was considered a serious offense against the community and the authority that sanctioned the agreement. This practice was by no means limited to the Andes. In ancient China, a similar concept existed. Parties to an agreement would take a cord and tie a series of complex, intricate knots that were unique to their arrangement. Each knot served as a mnemonic device, a physical trigger for remembering a specific clause or term. The cord would then be cut in half, with each party keeping one portion. This created a form of ancient authentication. Later, to confirm the agreement, the two halves would be rejoined. If the knots matched perfectly, the contract was validated. This system ensured that neither party could later alter the terms, as their half alone would be useless for proving anything. It was a brilliantly simple way to create a checks and balances system using nothing more than string and memory. The knot-tying agreement reveals a profound human insight. We think with our hands. By externalizing a promise into a physical form, we make it more real, more memorable, and more binding. The very complexity of the knots required focus and intention to create, preventing impulsive agreements. The resulting object stood as a silent, persistent witness to the pact, a constant reminder of one's obligations that could be seen and touched long after the words of the negotiation had faded. It was a contract that engaged the senses, proving that sometimes the tightest bonds are those we literally tie ourselves. Moving from the intricate symbolism of knotted cords, we arrive at a contract that engaged the most fundamental of human senses, taste. The shared drink toast was a pact you could literally swallow, an agreement that passed your lips and entered your body, transforming a social ritual into a profound physiological commitment. This wasn't about quenching thirst, it was about consuming a promise, making the terms of an alliance as integral to one's being as the wine or mead itself. Across the ancient world, from the roaring mead halls of the Vikings to the sophisticated symposia of Rome, the raising of a cup was a gesture heavy with contractual weight, a silent language of clinking vessels that could secure peace or pledge fealty. Consider the Viking tradition of the toast. In their rugged, honor-based society, words spoken over a drink were not casual pleasantries but binding oaths, witnessed by the entire community gathered in the longhouse. The chieftain would raise his great drinking horn, often intricately carved and metal-rimmed, and propose a toast to the gods, to a fallen hero, or to a forthcoming raid. As the horn was passed from warrior to warrior, each man who drank from it was not just sharing the potent mead, he was implicitly endorsing the chieftain's words and pledging his own strength to the cause. To drink was to consent. The act was so powerful that refusing our offered drink was a grave insult, a public rejection of the proposed bond. The beverage itself was believed to be infused with the spirit of the vow, and by consuming it, the warriors were internalizing that spirit, making the promise a part of their very blood and bone. This made betrayal not just a social transgression but a form of spiritual poisoning, a violation of something that had literally become a part of you. The Romans elevated this practice into a complex art of diplomacy and social climbing. At a Roman convivium or banquet, the act of toasting was a carefully choreographed dance of political ambition. A host might offer a toast to a powerful guest using a precious silver calyx, a clear signal of respect and a non-verbal offer of alliance. The guest, by accepting the drink and reciprocating the toast, was accepting the terms of that unspoken agreement, perhaps a promise of political support or a lucrative business deal. The wine itself was central to the ritual. It was often mixed with water in a large communal bowl called a crater, symbolizing the blending of the participants' fortunes and intentions. To share wine from the same crater was to declare that your interests were now mingled. The consequences of betraying a toast-based pact in Rome were more social than spiritual, but could be equally devastating. A man who reneged on an agreement sealed with wine would find himself shut out of future invitations, his reputation for trustworthiness shattered in the gossipy halls of the forum, effectively ending his political or commercial prospects. This ancient contract reveals a deep, almost primal understanding of consumption as an act of trust. When you eat or drink something offered by another, you are making yourself vulnerable. In a world where poisons were a common tool of assassination, accepting a drink was the ultimate sign of faith. The host, by drinking first from the same vessel, would prove its safety, demonstrating goodwill. The guest, by then drinking, demonstrated their trust in that goodwill. This mutual vulnerability created an immediate and powerful bond. The ritual transformed a simple beverage into a liquid contract, with each sip serving as a reaffirmation of the pledge. The shared drink toast shows us that some of the most binding agreements in human history were not filed away in archives, but were dissolved on the tongue and carried in the bloodstream, a fleeting taste that could leave a permanent mark on the world. While the shared drink created a bond that flowed through the very veins of those who partook, other ancient societies sought to anchor their most vital agreements not within the body, but directly onto the earth itself. This brings us to the profound and enduring concept of the land boundary stone, a practice where a simple, often unadorned rock became the ultimate silent witness to a promise, transforming the very landscape into a living contract. In a world where survival depended on land for farming, grazing, hunting, and living, the precise demarcation of territory was not a matter of petty dispute but a foundational element of social order and peace. The boundary stone stood as the immutable arbiter of these essential agreements, a permanent and unquestionable marker that everyone in the community understood and was honor-bound to respect. The power of these stones lay in their absolute clarity. In an age before satellite surveys and detailed property maps, a large, prominently placed stone served as an unmistakable reference point. In ancient Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, these stones were known as kuduras, but these were far more than simple markers. They were intricate legal documents carved in stone. A typical kuduru would be covered in detailed inscriptions and powerful symbols. It might feature the image of a shovel representing the god Marduk or a sitting dog symbolizing the goddess Gula. These weren't mere decorations, they were divine signatures. By etching the images of their gods onto the stone, the Babylonians were effectively placing the contract under divine protection. The inscription would detail the exact dimensions of the land, the names of the parties involved, and the terms of the agreement, whether it was a sale, a gift from the king, or a resolution of a dispute. To move or damage a kuduru was not just a crime against your neighbor. It was an act of sacrilege against the gods whose images stared back at you from the granite, inviting their direct and terrible wrath. This practice was a global phenomenon, a universal solution to a universal human problem. The Romans, masters of administration and law, had their termini. These boundary stones were dedicated to the god Terminus, a deity so steadfast that, according to legend, when the Romans were constructing a temple to Jupiter, all the other gods willingly moved aside for the king of the gods, except for Terminus. His stone refused to budge, and so it was incorporated directly into the temple's wall, symbolizing that boundaries were ultimately inviolable. Every year on the festival of Terminalia, landowners would gather with their families at these marker stones. They would adorn them with garlands, make offerings of cakes and wine, and reaffirm their mutual respect for the boundary in a joyful celebration of good neighbors and stable property rights. This ritual transformed a static object into a living part of the community's social fabric, a yearly renewal of a silent contract that ensured harmony and prevented the kind of bitter feuds that could tear villages apart. The consequences of violating this non-verbal contract were severe and immediate. To secretly shift a boundary stone under cover of darkness was one of the most dishonorable acts imaginable in the ancient world. It was a theft not just of land but of a family's livelihood and future. In the Hebrew Bible, the book of Deuteronomy explicitly condemns this act, stating, "Cursed is anyone who moves their neighbor's boundary stone," a curse that the entire community was expected to affirm. In many cultures, the punishment was death because the crime was seen as a threat to the entire community's stability. If one person could steal land by moving a stone, then no one's property was safe, and the social order would collapse into chaos. The boundary stone was therefore a pact between all members of the community to uphold a system of fairness and respect. It was a contract that said, "We all agree that this line on the earth is real, and we will all act as if it is real for the good of everyone." This collective agreement, symbolized by a single stone, allowed societies to grow and prosper without constant conflict over their most precious resource, proving that sometimes the simplest markers can hold the greatest peace. Now, shift your focus from the sacred and solemn to the wonderfully practical and bustling energy of the ancient marketplace. Picture the crowded, sun-baked streets of a Mesopotamian bazaar, a cacophony of bleating animals hammering metal, and the shouts of hundreds of merchants and customers. In this overwhelming din, how could a serious trader possibly negotiate a complex deal for a shipment of copper or a herd of goats without screaming themselves hoarse? The answer was a brilliantly efficient system of silent auction gestures, a non-verbal contract that turned the chaotic market into a theater of subtle, discreet communication. This wasn't just a convenience, it was a sophisticated language of hands and eyes that allowed commerce to thrive in the most challenging conditions. This system functioned on a foundation of mutually understood signals, a kind of code that was learned and respected by everyone in the trading community. A prospective buyer might approach a stall, examine a bolt of fine linen, and then catch the seller's eye. Instead of shouting a price over the noise, the buyer might simply tap a specific finger against their palm. To an outsider, it would look like a casual fidget, but to the seller, that tap meant a very specific number of silver shekels. The seller, in response, might shake their head slightly and hold up two fingers concealed against their leg. A subtle counter-offer. The negotiation would continue this way, a silent dance of gestures, until both parties gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. That final nod was the equivalent of a signed contract. The deal was sealed, the price was set, and the goods changed hands, all without a single word being spoken. This method provided a crucial layer of discretion, allowing a merchant to sell a large quantity of goods without publicly announcing the price, preventing competitors from undercutting them or sparking a panic that could destabilize the entire market's pricing. The beauty of this silent auction lay in its elegant solution to the universal problem of noise and misunderstanding. In a loud environment, spoken numbers can be easily misheard. A 15 could sound like a 50. Leading to costly disputes that could sour business relationships and even lead to violence. The gesture system eliminated this risk entirely. A visual signal is unambiguous. You either see the two fingers or you don't. It also protected privacy. A wealthy noble purchasing a rare jewel for his wife didn't need the entire market knowing how much he paid for it. And a merchant selling off surplus grain at a discount didn't want to alert his other customers to the lower price. This silent code created a sphere of privacy in the most public of spaces, allowing for sensitive negotiations to proceed smoothly and without unwanted attention. It built a powerful sense of community and trust among the traders who knew the code. Your reputation was built on honoring the deals you sealed with a gesture, and a merchant known to renege on a silently agreed price would quickly find themselves isolated and unable to do business. This ancient practice is far from extinct. Its direct descendant lives on in the modern commodity exchanges and stock trading floors of today's financial centers. Step onto the trading floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and you'll witness a whirlwind of frantic hand signals traders using complex gestures to buy and sell vast quantities of pork bellies or treasury bonds in fractions of a second. While technology now records these transactions, the core principle remains identical to the Mesopotamian bazaar. In an environment of overwhelming sensory input, the clearest, fastest, and most reliable way to seal a binding deal is through the universal, unspoken language of gesture. It's a stunning continuum that connects a modern financier in a colorful jacket to an ancient Sumerian merchant, both relying on the same fundamental human ingenuity to turn a simple hand motion into a powerful and binding economic contract. But perhaps the most visually stunning and physically expressive of all these silent contracts was the ritual dance pact, where an entire community's promise was written not on paper or stone, but in the very movement of their bodies. Imagine a tense standoff between two tribes who have been feuding for generations. Instead of exchanging lengthy written treaties they couldn't read or relying on interpreters they didn't trust, they choose a different path to peace. They decide to dance. This was not entertainment. It was a profound and binding performance where every step, every turn, and every synchronized beat was a clause in a living, breathing agreement. The dance floor became the negotiating table, and the rhythm was the unspoken language of accord. The power of this pact lay in its requirement for perfect synchrony. To dance together successfully, the participants from both groups had to listen to the same drumbeat, watch each other's movements, and literally get in step with one another. This physical harmony was a powerful metaphor for the social and political harmony they sought to achieve. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea, for instance, rival clans would sometimes resolve conflicts through elaborate sing-sing ceremonies. Hundreds of warriors, adorned in spectacular feathered headdresses and vibrant body paint, would perform complex, synchronized dances that could last for hours. The precise coordination required sent a clear message: we are capable of acting as one, we can move together without conflict, our communities can find a shared rhythm. A misstep or break in the formation wasn't just an embarrassment. It could be seen as a bad omen or a sign of insincerity, potentially derailing the entire peace process. The dance was a test of commitment and a demonstration of unity, all without a single word of negotiation. This concept extended far beyond peace treaties. Among the Trobriand Islanders, famously studied by anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, elaborate, multi-day dance ceremonies called kayasa were central to establishing complex trading partnerships known as kula. These exchanges of shell armbands and necklaces created vast networks of obligation and status across hundreds of miles of ocean. The kayasa dance was the essential prelude that formalized these partnerships. Through the shared, exhausting, and joyous act of dancing, potential kula partners built the trust and camaraderie necessary to enter into a lifelong exchange relationship. The dance served as the non-verbal contract that bound them, a physical experience of cooperation that preceded the exchange of valuable objects. The spiritual dimension of these dance pacts was often immense. Many cultures believed that synchronized movement could align the spiritual energy of the participants, creating a temporary state of perfect balance and connection. To break the agreement afterwards was not merely a social faux pas. It was believed to violently shatter this hard-won spiritual harmony, unleashing misfortune or divine displeasure upon the oath breaker. The dance was more than a symbol. It was the mechanism that wove the communities together on every level: physical, social, and spiritual. It was a contract you performed with your entire being, a promise made not just with your mind but with your muscles, your breath, and your sweat, leaving a memory in the body that was as indelible as any signature on a page. But if a dance was a contract written in movement, and a boundary stone was a contract carved into the earth, then the token exchange system was perhaps the most elegantly portable contract ever devised. This was the art of miniaturizing a promise, of condensing a complex agreement into a small, tangible object that could be carried in a pouch, held in the hand, and passed from person to person. In a world before paper was commonplace, These tokens served as the ultimate mnemonic devices, physical, durable reminders of debts, loyalties, and vows that might otherwise be forgotten or disputed over time. They transformed abstract promises into concrete reality, giving weight and form to the invisible bonds of human agreement. The genius of this system was its beautiful simplicity and flexibility. A token could be almost anything, as long as its meaning was mutually understood by the parties involved. A smooth, black river stone might represent a promise to deliver a dozen bushel of wheat after the next harvest. An intricately carved shell could be a pledge of military aid between two chieftains. A small bronze arrowhead might signify a debt of one sheep. The object itself was often worthless in terms of its material value. Its true worth was purely symbolic, acting as a key that unlocked a specific memory and a specific obligation. The physical act of handing over the token was the moment the contract was sealed. The receiver gained not just an object but a claim, a right to call upon the giver to fulfill their promise. Holding the token was proof that the agreement existed, a silent witness that could be presented months or even years later to remind the other party of their duty. Nowhere was this system more sophisticated than in ancient Mesopotamia, the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers where large-scale trade and administration first flourished. Here they developed the remarkable cylinder seal. This was a small, cylindrical stone, often made of hematite or lapis lazuli, intricately engraved with a unique pattern of scenes and cuneiform characters. A merchant or official would roll this seal over a soft clay tablet, leaving behind a raised, continuous impression that served as their signature, authenticating contracts, ownership, and orders. But the exchange of the seal itself was an even more powerful act. Giving your personal cylinder seal to another person was an act of immense trust. It was literally handing them your identity, your authority to act on your behalf. It was a non-verbal contract that said, "I empower you to conduct business in my name," or "I pledge my entire estate as guarantee for this debt." Losing control of your seal could be financially catastrophic, as anyone in possession of it could forge your agreements. Therefore, the voluntary exchange of seals was a profound gesture of faith, a binding pact that placed immense power directly into another's hands. This method of contracting was not limited to grand civilizations. It was a universal solution. Among many Native American tribes, like the Algonquian peoples of the Northeast, the exchange of woven wampum belts was a formal way to ratify treaties and record historical events. These belts, made from carefully arranged purple and white shell beads, were not money in the way Europeans misunderstood them. They were a mnemonic device, a physical repository of a spoken agreement. The specific patterns of the beads helped the speaker recall the exact terms of the treaty clause by clause. To present a wampum belt was to present the treaty itself. To accept it was to accept its terms, and to break the agreement was to desecrate the sacred object that held its memory. Similarly, in parts of Africa, the exchange of specially carved staffs or rods could formalize alliances between villages, with the object serving as a perpetual symbol of the pact, often stored in a place of honor and brought out for ceremonial reaffirmations. The token exchange system reveals a fundamental truth about human psychology. We think best with our hands. We are tactile creatures who find abstract concepts easier to grasp when they have a physical form. A promise feels more real, more binding when you can hold a piece of it in your hand. A debt is harder to ignore when a constant, tangible reminder of it sits in your home. These tokens created a lasting connection between the two parties, a thread of obligation that stretched across time and space. They were the perfect tool for a mobile world, allowing a merchant to carry proof of a dozen different agreements from a dozen different cities all in a single bag. enabling commerce and diplomacy to weave a web of connection across the ancient world, one small, significant object at a time. Now, we move from the portable promise of the token to one of the most universal and awe-inspiring elements known to humanity: fire. To ancient peoples, fire was a sacred mystery. It warmed, it protected, it transformed raw food into nourishment, and it reached up toward the heavens. It's no surprise then that this primal force became the centerpiece of one of the most solemn non-verbal contracts, the sacred fire ceremony. This was not a casual handshake or a simple exchange. This was an agreement forged in the elemental crucible of transformation itself, a pact made under the watchful eyes of the gods. The power of this ritual lay in fire's unique duality. It was both a purifier and a destroyer. It could cleanse, but it could also consume utterly. To make a promise in the presence of such a force was to acknowledge the ultimate stakes of the agreement. In the ancient Vedic traditions of India, this concept was formalized into a beautiful and precise ritual. When two parties needed to seal a pact, they would gather before a consecrated fire, often attended by priests. The key act was pradakshina, circumambulating the fire together. Walking clockwise around the sacred flames, they weren't just performing a gesture, they were literally encircling their agreement with a ring of divine witness. The fire, representing deities like Agni, the god of fire and messenger to the gods, was now a party to the contract. The crackling flames were seen as the audible assent of the divine, and the smoke carried the terms of the agreement up to the heavens for cosmic record-keeping. The contract became a part of the universal order, as immutable as the laws that governed the stars. This idea of fire as a divine witness was a global phenomenon. The ancient Zoroastrians of Persia tended eternal flames in their temples, believing fire to be a visible manifestation of the divine light of wisdom and truth. To swear an oath before such a flame was to swear on the very essence of truth itself. Similarly, in ancient Greece, oaths were often sworn over a fire sacrifice, with the understanding that the gods, attracted by the smoke and aroma, were now present and listening. The transformative nature of the fire was central to the contract's gravity. Just as fire irrevocably turns wood to ash and smoke, the agreement was meant to be permanent and unchangeable. You could no more take back a vow sworn in the fire than you could reassemble a piece of burnt wood. This understanding created a psychological and spiritual barrier against betrayal that was far more powerful than any earthly law. The consequences of breaking a fire-sealed pact were believed to be of a cosmic scale. This wasn't merely a social dishonor or a legal penalty. It was an offense against the natural and divine order. In Vedic belief, violating such an agreement would generate a specific, negative karmic consequence, a spiritual debt that would have to be repaid in this life or the next. The Roman historian Livy recounts stories of generals and diplomats making treaties ratified by fire sacrifices, with a dire warning that just as the animal victim was slain and consumed by the flames, so too would the person who broke the treaty be destroyed by the gods. The fire ceremony elevated a simple agreement into a sacred covenant, making the potential fallout not just practical but existential. It was the ultimate way to say, "This promise is bigger than both of us," anchoring human trust in the unshakable foundations of the cosmos itself. While fire ceremonies bound agreements through transformative power and divine witness, other ancient rituals sought to seal pacts through a far more introspective and elegant medium, the mirror. In the sophisticated courts of ancient East Asia, particularly in China and Japan, the exchange of finely crafted bronze mirrors became a profound non-verbal contract, one that spoke not to the gods but to the very soul. This was no mere gift, it was a symbolic surrender of one's hidden intentions, a pledge to reflect only truth in the relationship. The mirror, in these cultures, was far more than a tool for vanity. It was a potent metaphor for the conscience, believed to reveal not just the outer face, but the inner heart, exposing any flaw or deception hidden within. The act of giving a mirror was therefore an act of breathtaking vulnerability and trust. You were effectively saying, "I give you this object that reveals all. I have nothing to hide from you. See me as I truly am." This made it an ideal instrument for sealing the most delicate of alliances, diplomatic marriages between powerful clans or peace treaties between rival states. When a princess was sent to marry a prince from a neighboring kingdom, her dowry would often include an exquisite mirror. This wasn't just a valuable commodity, it was the physical embodiment of the contract between the two families. The mirror represented the promise that she would be a true and loyal partner, reflecting well on her new family and faithfully representing their interests. Similarly, two warring lords concluding a truce might exchange mirrors as a pledge that their future dealings would be conducted with clarity and honesty, with no hidden agendas or reflected deceptions. The consequence of breaking a mirror-sealed pact was a uniquely powerful social and spiritual punishment. It wasn't merely a breach of contract, it was a shattering of the very metaphor that held the agreement together. If you betrayed a partner after exchanging mirrors, you were not just lying, you were actively distorting the reflection of reality. This was believed to have tangible, terrible effects. In the complex social codes of honor that governed East Asian aristocracy, such an act would result in an irreversible loss of face or honor. Your public persona, your carefully constructed image of integrity, would be utterly destroyed. But the belief went even deeper. Many held that the distortion was not just social but metaphysical. The broken promise was thought to literally cloud the mirror's surface, making it unable to reflect a clear image ever again. It was as if the object itself bore the stain of the betrayal, a permanent, visible reminder of the trust that had been fractured. This poetic connection between action and object made the mirror exchange one of the most psychologically potent contracts in history, a beautiful and terrifying reminder that some promises, once broken, can forever change how we see ourselves and are seen by others. Now consider the profound vulnerability of ancient travel, a world without roadside assistance, secure inns, or instant communication. To embark on any journey, whether across a desert or through a mountain pass, was to step into a realm of immense personal risk. In this context, the simple act of traveling alongside someone else forged one of the most immediate and powerful non-verbal contracts imaginable, the shared journey pact. This was not a casual companionship, it was a silent vow of mutual survival, an unspoken agreement that for the duration of the trek, your fates were inextricably linked. The contract was sealed not with a handshake or a signed document, but with the first shared step on the path ahead. This pact operated on a powerful principle of reciprocal vulnerability and trust. On the open road, everyone was equally exposed to the same elemental threats: bandits lurking in narrow gorges, predatory animals stalking from the shadows, sudden storms that could wipe out a trail, or the simple, gnawing peril of starvation and thirst. This shared vulnerability became the foundation of the contract. By choosing to continue traveling together, you were each acknowledging that your individual chance of survival was vastly improved through cooperation. This created an obligation that transcended language, culture, or social status. A wealthy merchant and his lowly porter, a soldier and a fleeing refugee on the road, they became temporary equals bound by the same urgent need for mutual protection. The agreement demanded that you share your water when the other's skin ran dry, stand guard while the other slept, and defend each other against attack without a moment's hesitation. Your resources, your vigilance, and your strength became a common pool for the benefit of the traveling party. The legendary Silk Road provides the ultimate example of this contract in action. This wasn't a single road but a sprawling network of trade routes connecting east and west, traversed by caravans of merchants from vastly different worlds. A caravan might include Persians, Chinese, Sogdians, and Romans, none speaking the same language. Yet, for months on end, they formed a mobile, cooperative society governed by the unspoken rules of the journey. They shared the burden of navigating treacherous terrain, collectively decided on safe camping spots, and formed a defensive perimeter each night. The success of the entire enterprise and the immense wealth being transported depended entirely on the integrity of this silent pact between every single member of the caravan. To betray a fellow traveler on the Silk Road was not just a crime against an individual, it was a threat to the entire system of trust that made long-distance trade possible. A merchant known to have abandoned his companions in a crisis would find himself blacklisted, unable to find another caravan willing to accept the liability of his presence. The dishonor of breaking this pact was considered particularly heinous because it exploited a state of granted trust. When you traveled with someone, you revealed your weaknesses to them. You showed them where you kept your money, how you reacted when exhausted, and when you were at your most defenseless. To turn on a travel companion was therefore seen as the deepest form of treachery, a violation that was both personal and profoundly cowardly. Many ancient legal codes, including those of the Bedouins and various steppe nomads, prescribed severe punishments for such acts, often involving exile from the community, a fate nearly equivalent to a death sentence for people whose survival depended on group cohesion. The shared journey pact demonstrates with stunning clarity that sometimes the most binding agreements are those born from shared hardship, proving that the road itself could be a relentless and effective enforcer of human honor. Now consider a pact made not just between people, but in the presence of the divine. In countless ancient societies, the act of praying together, or even simply in each other's presence, formed one of the most unbreakable non-verbal contracts imaginable. This silent prayer agreement transformed a personal promise into a sacred covenant, witnessed by powers far greater than any earthly king or court. Imagine two merchants in ancient Egypt standing before a statue of Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. They don't recite a legal document. Instead, they bow their heads in silent, simultaneous prayer. In that shared moment of devotion, a powerful deal is sealed. Their private thoughts become the terms, and the god himself becomes the notary and enforcer. This was a contract written on the soul, with consequences that echoed into the afterlife. The immense power of this pact came from its dual enforcement mechanism. On one hand, there was the powerful social pressure. In a deeply religious community, being known as someone who broke an oath sworn before the gods was social suicide. Your reputation for piety and trustworthiness, the very bedrock of your standing in the community, would be instantly shattered. But far more potent was the belief in supernatural retribution. In ancient Greece, when two parties swore an oath over a sacrifice, they weren't just asking the gods to watch, they were actively calling down a curse upon themselves if they were to break their word. The famous Greek oath-swearing ritual often included phrases like, "If I break this oath, may Zeus destroy my home, my family, and my future." This wasn't considered empty words, it was a genuine invocation of divine punishment. The fear wasn't of a lawsuit but of a plague, a failed harvest, or a personal tragedy sent by an angered deity. This belief system provided an enforcement mechanism that was omnipresent and inescapable, operating even when no human eyes were watching. This practice was beautifully formalized in the Roman concept of the ius iurandum, the sworn oath. For the Romans, an oath was not merely a promise, it was a religious act. A general swearing to uphold a treaty would do so at a temple, placing his hand on the altar of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. By doing so, he was pledging the entire Roman state as the guarantor of his vow. To break it would not only dishonor him but would bring the wrath of the gods upon all of Rome. This belief was so strong that it often bound enemies more effectively than any written treaty. Even across cultural lines, the recognition of a solemn oath before a deity created a universal standard of trust. A Carthaginian general and a Roman consul might not share a language or a culture, but they shared an understanding that an oath sworn before their respective gods was absolutely binding. The silent prayer agreement thus became the ultimate cross-cultural moral currency, a way to build bridges of trust where human laws and languages failed. It acknowledged a higher authority that all parties respected, creating a foundation for agreement that was, for its time, the most reliable system on Earth. After the profound vulnerability of shared travel, we arrive at a contract that represented the ultimate offering, the very essence of life itself. The animal sacrifice covenant stands as one of the most intense and solemn non-verbal agreements ever conceived, a pact sealed not with a handshake or a token, but with blood and breath. This was far more than a religious ceremony. It was a visceral, terrifyingly tangible way to make a promise, where the stakes of betrayal were believed to be nothing less than annihilation, witnessed by the gods and sealed by death. To understand the gravity of this ritual, we must step into the mindset of the ancient world, where life was precarious and survival was a daily struggle. In such an environment, an animal was not just property, it was wealth, security, and future sustenance. A sheep could provide wool for years, a goat could supply milk, and a bull was a powerhouse for plowing fields. To willingly take such a valuable creature and end its life was an act of immense consequence. It represented a massive, irreversible investment in the agreement about to be made. The sacrifice itself was the down payment, a non-refundable premium paid to the divine to ensure the contract's integrity. This act communicated a clear message to all participants. What we are agreeing to is so important that I am willing to destroy a part of my own future to prove my commitment to it. The ritual's power was magnified by its shared, participatory nature. This wasn't a spectacle to be watched. It was an experience to be consumed, literally. In the ancient Greek tradition of making a treaty or spondi, the ceremony was precise and deeply symbolic. A priest would sacrifice a piglet, a lamb, or most powerfully, a bull. The animal's throat would be cut, and its blood would be collected in a special bowl. The negotiating parties would then dip their hands or weapons into the warm blood, or sometimes even walk between the halves of the bisected animal. This gruesome act was a powerful curse upon themselves. May what happened to this animal happen to me if I break this oath. But the ritual didn't end with death. The animal was then butchered and cooked, and a sacred meal was shared by all parties. By eating the flesh of the same sacrificed animal, the participants were believed to absorb a shared sacred essence, becoming a single community bound by the life that had been given up to create their bond. The contract moved from a legal concept to a physiological reality, internalized by all. This practice was central to the ancient Hebrew worldview, where the concept of the Brit or covenant was foundational to their relationship with God. The book of Genesis describes a chilling scene where God instructs Abraham to prepare a sacrifice for a covenant ceremony. Abraham cuts several animals in half and arranges the pieces opposite each other. As the sun sets, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch representing God's presence pass between the pieces. This terrifying act signifies God himself taking the oath of the covenant, invoking the curse upon himself should he be unfaithful. The message was absolute. This agreement is sealed in life and death. and its violation carries the ultimate price. The gravity of this moment echoes throughout the Hebrew scriptures, establishing a template for how the most serious agreements were made. The psychological and spiritual enforcement mechanism here was arguably the most powerful ever devised. The fear wasn't of a human court or social shame. It was of a cosmic, inescapable retribution. To break an oath sworn over a sacrifice was to invite a curse of unimaginable proportions. A Greek warrior who betrayed such a pact might believe he was condemning his family line to extinction. A Hebrew king violating a covenant might fear his entire nation would be struck with plague or famine. This belief system created a near-absolute guarantee. It was the ultimate deterrent, making these contracts the gold standard for agreements where trust was minimal, but the need for reliability was absolute. Treaties between bitter enemies, alliances between rival dynasties, and vows between humans and their gods. The animal sacrifice covenant shows us that in the search for unbreakable trust, ancient peoples were willing to use the most potent currency they had, life itself, offered up in the faith that some promises must be as permanent as death. Imagine the tension in a Germanic chieftain's hall, moments after a brutal feud has been settled. The air, thick with the memory of violence, now hangs heavy with the possibility of peace. Then a gesture that would seem unthinkable to a modern mind. A warrior slowly, deliberately, unbuckles his own sword belt. He doesn't merely set it aside. He offers the hilt of his weapon, the very instrument of his power and protection, to his former enemy. This was the symbolic weapon exchange, a non-verbal contract so profound that it could turn sworn adversaries into blood-bound allies with a single, silent act of incredible trust. In a world defined by martial prowess, your weapon was an extension of your arm, your honor, and your identity. To willingly hand it over was to offer a piece of your very soul as collateral for peace. This ritual was far more complex than a simple surrender. It was a meticulously choreographed dance of power and vulnerability. The weapon itself was chosen with immense care. Presenting a finely crafted, pattern-welded sword, its hilt inlaid with gold and garnets, was a statement of immense respect. It said, "I value this piece so highly that I offer you the best work of my finest smith, an object worthy of a king." Conversely, accepting such a weapon came with its own heavy obligation. In the Celtic traditions of Europe, for instance, accepting a spear from a rival chieftain meant you were now honor-bound to use it only in his defense, or at the very least, to never turn its point against him or his kin. The exchanged weapon became a sacred token, a constant physical reminder of the pledge made. It was often displayed prominently in the recipient's hall, not as a trophy of war, but as a monument to peace, a silent witness to all who entered that a bond of trust now existed where once there was only animosity. The psychological genius of this pact lay in its creation of a perfect, if tense, balance. The exchanged weapons acted as symbolic hostages. Each leader now held a piece of the other's martial power. If one chieftain were to break the treaty and attack, he would not only be committing betrayal but would also be forcing his former ally to defend himself using his own beautifully crafted sword. This created a bizarre and powerful deterrent. To initiate violence was to arm your enemy with a weapon you yourself had provided, a constant visual reminder of your own broken faith. This system transformed objects designed for killing into the strongest possible instruments of peace, leveraging the very culture of violence to enforce its opposite. The consequences for violating this specific contract were uniquely severe, striking at the heart of a warrior's identity. To break an oath sealed by a weapon exchange was considered the ultimate perfidy, a betrayal that corrupted the very essence of honor. In the sagas of the Norse, a man who betrayed such a pact was not merely an enemy. He was a Nithinger, a villain of the lowest order, devoid of all honor, an outcast who could be killed on sight by anyone without consequence. The social and spiritual stain was considered so deep that it could tarnish a family's name for generations. This was because the crime wasn't just against a person. It was a perversion of the sacred relationship between a warrior and his weapon, a betrayal of the trust that allowed society to function beyond perpetual warfare. The symbolic weapon exchange thus stands as a stunning paradox, a contract that used the instruments of death to solemnize a promise of life, proving that even in the most martial cultures, the most powerful weapon was not the sword in your hand, but the trust you placed in another's. Now imagine a different kind of pact, one designed not for immediate ceremony but for the test of time and distance. This was the coin break agreement, a brilliantly simple solution to a universal human problem. How do you remember a promise made today when you might not see the other person again for years? The answer lay in taking something whole and valuable and breaking it in two, creating a physical, portable key to a memory that would otherwise fade. This wasn't just a symbol, it was a sophisticated system of verification, a tangible link between two people that could span continents and decades, waiting for the day the pieces would finally fit back together. The ritual was elegant in its simplicity. Two parties would take a silver coin, a medallion, or even a carved piece of ivory. With a sharp chisel or a strong blade, they would carefully split the object right down the middle. This act of destruction was the very moment the contract was born. Each person would then take one half, often inscribing their own mark on the flat, broken edge. The message was powerful and clear. This object is now incomplete without its other half, just as my promise is incomplete without your reciprocal action to fulfill it. The two jagged pieces were a perfect metaphor for the agreement itself. Only when they were reunited would the original wholeness and the successful conclusion of the pact be restored. This method transformed an abstract vow into a concrete object that could be held, stored, and physically presented as proof. This practice found a perfect home in the sprawling trade networks of medieval Europe. A merchant from Venice, about to embark on a 2-year trading voyage to Alexandria, might need to leave a large sum of money with a business partner to invest in his absence. How could he be sure that upon his return the partner would honestly account for the profits? They would break a coin. The merchant would sail away with one half. The partner would keep the other with the capital. Years later, when the ship finally returned to port, the merchant would present his half. The partner would produce his, and the two pieces would be fitted together. If the marks and the break aligned perfectly, it was the ultimate authentication proof positive of their original agreement and a trigger for the final settling of accounts. This simple act eliminated the need for complex written contracts that might be lost or forged, creating a trust system that was both personal and incredibly secure. The genius of the coin break was its built-in foolproof security feature. The unique, irregular fracture line of each broken object was impossible to replicate perfectly. A forger might try to create a convincing duplicate half, but without the original piece to match it against, the deception would be instantly revealed the moment the two halves failed to lock together seamlessly. This made the system far more reliable than a signature or a seal, which could be copied or stolen. The broken coin was a unique key, and only the two original holders possessed the two parts that could make it turn. This system was remarkably versatile. Beyond commerce, it was used to seal treaties between lords, where the broken pieces were kept in separate treasuries as a record of the accord. It was even used in some cultures as a form of engagement token, where a broken coin pledged a couple to be married, with the reunion of the pieces symbolizing the completion of their union during the wedding ceremony. The coin break agreement demonstrates a timeless human truth. Sometimes the most powerful bonds are those we literally break to make. For cultures whose lives were dictated by the rhythm of the waves, a simple handshake on dry land was not enough to seal a promise of true importance. The Phoenicians, those master mariners who braved the unknown waters of the Mediterranean and beyond, developed a powerful variation, the hand clasp over water. This was not merely a pact between two people, it was a covenant made with the sea itself as their witness. Imagine two merchants on a wooden pier, a traded vessel bobbing gently beside them. Instead of clasping hands in the air, they would lean over the side, their joined grip hovering directly above the dark, reflective surface. In that moment, their agreement was immersed in the very element that gave them life, wealth, and peril. The water below mirrored their gesture, creating a second, spectral handshake from the depths, as if the sea god was himself reaching up to join the pact and acknowledge its terms. The symbolism here is profoundly beautiful and deeply logical for a seafaring people. Water is the ultimate paradox. It is fluid and changeable, capable of shifting from a glassy calm to a murderous rage in moments, yet it is also constant and reliable in its cycles. The tides are unceasing. They retreat and advance with a predictability that ancient sailors learned to trust with their lives. By sealing a deal over this element, the parties were invoking this duality. Their agreement was meant to be as adaptable as water, able to flow around unforeseen obstacles, but also as steadfast and unwavering as the tides themselves. It was a promise that would hold through any storm. This ritual was especially potent for the Vikings, who saw the sea not as a mere expanse of water, but as a living, breathing entity teeming with gods and spirits. To clasp hands over the waves was to call upon En-Yerther, the god of the sea and wealth, or Aegir, the ruler of the ocean itself, to act as enforcers. A violation of such an oath wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was an affront to these powerful deities, an act of arrogance that was believed to guarantee a catastrophic reckoning. The offender might find their next voyage plagued by contrary winds, becalmed seas, or the sudden, terrifying appearance of the dreaded kraken, all seen as the direct wrath of an angered ocean. This practice reveals a breathtaking level of integration between daily life and the spiritual world for these ancient sailors. Their entire existence was a conversation with the sea. It provided their food, their highways for trade, and their greatest dangers. It made perfect sense that their most solemn agreements would be brought to this power for sanction. The handclasp over water was a contract that acknowledged humanity's ultimate dependence on forces far greater than itself. It was a humble and powerful recognition that while two men might make a deal, its success and its endurance were ultimately in the hands of the capricious, mighty, and unforgiving sea. After the profound intensity of the animal sacrifice and the symbolic exchange of weapons, we arrive at a contract that is its perfect opposite, a pact forged not in action but in its utter absence. The shared silence pact stands as one of the most subtle and sophisticated agreements in human history, a bond created by the deliberate and mutual decision to say nothing at all. In a world now saturated with constant noise and communication, this concept might seem passive or empty, but to ancient philosophical and monastic traditions, shared silence was an active, powerful, and deeply resonant state, a perfect meeting of minds where the deepest agreements were understood without a single word needing to be spoken. This practice found its most profound expression in the ancient East, within the contemplative traditions of Taoism and Buddhism. Here, silence was not merely the absence of sound, it was a fertile ground for wisdom, a space where the ego's chatter subsided and a deeper, more intuitive understanding could emerge. When two Taoist sages or Buddhist monks sat together in prolonged, comfortable silence, they were engaging in a form of deep communication far beyond the limitations of language. Words by their nature can be misinterpreted, can create distinctions, and can often obscure the truth they attempt to convey. Silence, however, was seen as the purest expression of reality itself, unadorned and undistorted. To willingly enter this state with another person was the ultimate sign of respect and trust. It signaled a belief that your companion was so attuned to the same fundamental truths that verbal explanation was not only unnecessary, but would actually diminish the understanding you shared. The silence itself became the contract, a mutual acknowledgement that you were both on the same path, seeking the same goals, and bound by the same philosophical principles. The act of breaking this silent pact was considered a serious violation, a fundamental breach of spiritual etiquette. In a Zen Buddhist context, for example, a master and student might sit in meditation for hours. For the student to suddenly break that silence with a trivial question or an impatient comment was not just a disruption. It was a demonstration that they had not yet achieved the inner stillness required for true understanding. They had, in effect, broken the unspoken agreement to dwell together in a state of mindful presence. The consequence was not punishment in a conventional sense, but a subtle yet powerful loss of standing. The master might simply resume the silence, their continued quietude speaking volumes about the student's lack of readiness. This reinforced the idea that the contract of shared silence was reserved for those who had earned the right to participate through discipline and inner development. It was a silent language that only the initiated could fluently speak and understand. This concept extended beyond the monastery walls into the realms of diplomacy and conflict resolution among ancient Eastern rulers and philosophers. Two warring generals brought together to negotiate a truce might first be encouraged to sit in silence together for a period of time. This was not wasted time, it was a crucial part of the negotiation. In the shared quiet, the artificial postures and bluster of warfare could slowly dissolve. Without the need to defend positions or articulate threats, a more genuine human connection could occasionally form. The silence allowed them to see each other not as abstract enemies, but as fellow human beings, ultimately sharing the same desire for peace and security. An agreement reached after such a period of shared silence was often far more durable because it was built on this fleeting moment of mutual recognition, a non-verbal truce that preceded the written terms. The shared silence pact demonstrates that the most powerful agreements are sometimes those that need no terms at all, existing instead in a sacred, wordless space of perfect mutual understanding. From the profound stillness of shared silence, we now turn to a contract that engaged all the senses in a celebration of life's fleeting beauty, the Garland exchange ritual. This was a pact that smelled of jasmine and roses, that felt cool and vibrant against the skin, and that visually declared an alliance in the most public and beautiful way possible. In the heat of an Indian summer or under the bright sun of the Mediterranean, the act of placing a woven circle of flowers around another person's neck was far more than a friendly gesture. It was a binding non-verbal contract, a promise as fragrant and colorful as the blossoms themselves, yet one that carried the subtle, sobering weight of impermanence. In the intricate social and spiritual tapestry of ancient India, the garland, or mala, was dense with meaning. Its use was central to the ceremony of Varmala, the garland exchange that forms a critical part of a Hindu wedding even today. When a bride and groom place floral garlands around each other's necks, they are participating in a ritual that is thousands of years old. This act is the moment they publicly accept each other as life partners. But its history runs even deeper into the realm of statecraft. A victorious king returning from battle would be greeted by his subjects not with a golden crown, but with garlands of victory. This was a contract of acclamation, the people's floral pledge of their continued loyalty, and the king's silent acceptance of his duty to rule justly and protect them. The flowers chosen were never arbitrary. Marigolds for prosperity, jasmine for purity, roses for love. Each blossom added its own specific clause to the unspoken agreement being woven together. Across the ancient world, in the symposiums and gymnasiums of Greece, a similar language of flowers flourished. Here, the garland was a Stephanos, and it was the ultimate symbol of honor and achievement. A triumphant Olympic athlete would receive a wreath of wild olive leaves, a contract that forever marked him as a hero to his city-state, granting him lifelong privileges and respect. To be crowned with such a garland was to enter into a permanent agreement with your community. You were now a living emblem of its glory, expected to embody its highest ideals. Similarly, a guest of honor at a feast would be crowned with a wreath of ivy or laurel, a fragrant contract of hospitality that obligated the host to provide protection and the guest to behave as a worthy recipient of that honor. The garland transformed a person into a walking monument to the agreement they had just made, its beauty attracting the admiration and the scrutiny of the entire community, ensuring that both parties would strive to uphold their ends of the bargain. The true genius of this floral contract, however, lay in its built-in reminder of life's most urgent lesson: time is precious. Unlike a stone monument or a metal token, a garland of fresh flowers is inherently ephemeral. Within hours, the vibrant petals would begin to wilt, their heady fragrance would start to fade, and within a day or two, the beautiful circle would wither and brown, crumbling to dust. This was not a design flaw, it was the entire point. The perishable nature of the garland was a powerful, non-verbal stipulation urging timely action. A peace treaty sealed with garlands between two rival city-states needed to be acted upon quickly before the flowers faded and with them, the momentum for peace. A marriage pledge required the couple to begin their life together with urgency and passion, not procrastination, reminded by their wilting crowns that love, like a flower, requires constant nurturing to survive. This beautiful fragility made the garland exchange a contract deeply aligned with the natural world, a poetic acknowledgement that all things, even our most solemn promises, exist within the flow of time, and that their value is amplified, not diminished, by their fleeting nature. Now we move from the fragrant and fleeting to the profoundly permanent, from a contract made of flowers to one literally set in stone, or rather, in mud. This is the footprint pact, an agreement where the very earth beneath your feet became the parchment, and your own body became the signing instrument. Imagine the scene: two tribal leaders or neighboring farmers standing on a plot of disputed land. The tension is palpable. Instead of a war of words, they choose a different path to resolution. A child is sent to the riverbank to fetch a bucket of thick, wet clay, which is poured and smoothed onto a flat stone or directly onto the ground. Then, with all parties watching, each leader steps forward, presses their bare foot firmly into the cool, yielding clay, leaving behind a deep, unmistakable impression. In that simple, silent act, a binding contract is born. The dispute is over, the boundary is set, the agreement is made, not with ink, but with the weight of a human presence, a mark as unique as a fingerprint and far more difficult to deny. The power of this pact lay in its breathtaking combination of practicality and profound symbolism. On the most basic level, it created an undeniable physical record. That clay tablet, once dried in the sun, became a durable document that could be stored, displayed, or even carried to a central authority as proof of the agreement. If a dispute arose later, the parties could simply retrieve the tablet. The evidence was right there, preserved in the hardened earth, the size, the shape, the very contours of the feet that made the pledge. This was a system of record-keeping that required no literacy, no special scribble skills, only the universal understanding that a man's footprint is his undeniable mark. But the symbolism reached much deeper. In many ancient cultures, the foot was not just a body part, it was a symbol of possession, authority, and connection. To place your foot on a piece of land was to claim it, to state, "I am here, and this place is under my power and my protection." By doing this together, the parties were performing a powerful pantomime of mutual ownership and shared responsibility. They were saying, "Our presence here is now intertwined. Our connection to this territory is equal and mutual, and our fates are now pressed into the same earth." We find evidence of this practice in one of the world's very first civilizations, ancient Mesopotamia. While they famously developed cuneiform writing on clay tablets, the older, non-verbal tradition of the footprint likely preceded it. For land sales or boundary agreements between those who couldn't write, pressing a foot or a foot-shaped amulet into the clay tablet served as a personal seal, a signature written in the language of the body. This concept of the foot representing a legal claim echoes throughout history. In the Hebrew Bible, the Book of Ruth mentions a custom where a man would finalize a transaction for a relative's property by removing his sandal and giving it to the other party, a symbolic variation of the footprint pact, where the sandal, which encases the foot, becomes the token of the agreement and the transfer of rights. This practice was by no means confined to the Middle East. Halfway across the world, many indigenous cultures of North America used similar rituals to seal treaties and agreements. For them, the act was deeply spiritual. The earth was not a piece of property to be owned, but a living mother to be respected. Pressing one's foot into the soil was an act of communion, a way of physically connecting one's spirit to the spirit of the land. A treaty sealed with footprints was therefore not just a political agreement between people. It was a sacred vow made before the land itself, with the parties promising to be good stewards of the territory they now shared. To break such an agreement was to violate a sacred trust with the earth, an act believed to bring imbalance and misfortune to everyone involved. The footprint pact thus stands as a stunningly universal and deeply human contract, a silent vow that used the most fundamental elements, the human body and the earth itself, to create a record of agreement that was personal, undeniable, and sacred. Now imagine the rhythmic sound of scythes cutting through a field of golden wheat, the shared grunts of effort as a heavy log is lifted into place for a new barn, the quiet, focused energy of a community working in unison toward a common goal. This was the shared labor agreement, a contract that was not spoken or signed but physically enacted, its terms written in sweat and solidarity. In the world of our ancestors, where survival was a direct product of grueling physical work, the most valuable currency was not gold or silver, but the willing strength of your neighbor's backs and arms. The act of working side by side created one of the most powerful and resilient non-verbal pacts in human history, a binding vow of mutual support that wove the very fabric of society. This system, often called a work party or bee, was the engine of every successful agricultural community. A single family could not possibly harvest all their grain before the rains came or raise a barn roof before the winter snows arrived. The solution was elegant and profoundly social. A farmer would let it be known that he needed help, and on the appointed day, the entire community would arrive at his fields or his homestead. There were no formal invitations or written contracts. The agreement was implicit, governed by a powerful principle of reciprocity that everyone understood. By showing up to swing a scythe in your neighbor's field today, you were not just being charitable, you were making a deposit into a community bank of labor. You were securing a promise that when your own crops ripened or your own roof leaked, that same neighbor, and indeed the whole village, would appear at your door, tools in hand, ready to repay the debt. This created a sprawling, invisible network of obligation that ensured no one family would face disaster alone. The terms of this contract were enforced by the most potent force in a small, interdependent community: social pressure and reputation. In a village where everyone knew everyone else's business, your standing was everything. A man who consistently showed up to work bees, who contributed his full effort, and who cheerfully shared the meal that always followed the labor, built a reputation as a reliable and honorable member of the community. This made him creditworthy not just in labor but in all things. Conversely, a person who was too lazy to help others, or who consistently found excuses to avoid his turn, was marked. He might not be formally punished, but he would find himself slowly and surely frozen out of the network of mutual aid. When his own crisis came, few would answer his call. His family might starve, or his house might remain unfinished. This wasn't seen as cruelty. It was the natural consequence of violating the community's most fundamental contract. The shame of this ostracism was a far more effective deterrent than any legal penalty could ever be. What's truly fascinating is how this ancient practice reveals a deep, intuitive understanding of economics and risk management long before these concepts were formally defined. The shared labor agreement was a brilliant system for smoothing out the unpredictable bumps of agrarian life. It pooled risk across the entire community. A hailstorm might destroy one family's crops, but it was unlikely to destroy every family's crops simultaneously. The labor system ensured that the unaffected families could help the afflicted one replant or rebuild, effectively acting as a living, breathing insurance policy. The festive atmosphere that accompanied these events, the shared meals, the storytelling, the courtship that happened on the sidelines, was not just a reward for hard work, it was a crucial part of the contract. These social rituals reinforced the bonds of affection and camaraderie that made the system work. They transformed a transactional agreement of labor for labor into a sacred covenant of community, ensuring that the contract was upheld not just out of obligation, but out of genuine care and shared identity. This silent pact, written in the language of shared toil and communal feasting, was ultimately what allowed humanity to move from isolated struggle to collective triumph. Now consider a contract that required no tools, no tokens, and no ceremony, only the simple, profound act of truly seeing another person. This was the eye contact covenant, a pact sealed not with a handshake or a spoken vow, but with a sustained and mutual gaze. In our modern world, we often avoid prolonged eye contact, perhaps finding it awkward or overly intimate. But in many ancient cultures, locking eyes was one of the most powerful ways to formalize a promise. It was a way of saying, "Look into my eyes and see the truth of my intention. I have nothing to hide from you." This silent gesture drew its immense power from a universal human understanding that the eyes are not just organs of sight, but windows to the soul, and to offer someone an unflinching view through that window was the ultimate act of sincerity. This practice was deeply rooted in our very biology. Human beings are uniquely equipped among animals to communicate volumes through our eyes. The sclera, the white part of our eye, is larger and more visible than in any other species, making the direction of our gaze incredibly easy for others to follow. This evolutionary trait suggests that reading each other's eyes has been fundamental to our social survival for millennia. When two people engage in prolonged eye contact, their brains undergo a fascinating change. The brainwave patterns of the two individuals can actually begin to synchronize, a phenomenon known as neural coupling. This creates a powerful, if subconscious, sense of connection and mutual understanding. Furthermore, sustained eye contact triggers the release of oxytocin, the same bonding hormone that fosters connection between a mother and her newborn child. Ancient peoples knew none of this science, of course, but they understood the effect instinctively. They felt the trust and connection that bloomed from a steady gaze, and they wisely harnessed this natural phenomenon to solemnize their most important agreements. We can see this principle at work in the traditions of the Maori people of New Zealand. Their famous haka, a ceremonial dance often performed to welcome guests or challenge enemies, is not about the aggressive shouts or the forceful body slaps. Its true power lies in the pukona, the widening of the eyes to an almost startling degree. During a haka, warriors would lock eyes with their counterparts, their wide, unblinking gaze serving as a direct challenge and a measure of the other's courage and honesty. To look away was to show fear or deceit. To meet the gaze was to accept the unspoken terms of the encounter. Similarly, in many Native American cultures, council meetings required speakers to maintain eye contact with the elders while stating their case. This was not a sign of aggression, but one of profound respect and honesty. It ensured that every word spoken was backed by the truth they believed in their hearts, a truth they were willing to have scrutinized in their own expression. The eyes became the lie detector test long before any machine was invented, a biological contract enforcer that everyone carried with them. The consequences of breaking this silent covenant were immediate and social. In a context where a deal was being sealed, if one party suddenly averted their gaze, it could instantly unravel hours of negotiation. That flicker of the eyes, that momentary glance away, was read as a telltale sign of hidden doubt, a concealed reservation, or outright dishonesty. It created a crack in the foundation of trust that was often impossible to repair. In cultures that relied on this practice, a person known for having a shifty gaze or for being unable to maintain eye contact was considered utterly unreliable, someone with whom no binding agreement could ever be made. Their social and economic prospects would be severely limited because they had proven themselves incapable of participating in this most basic yet profound human contract. The eye contact covenant thus distilled the entire complex concept of trust into a single, silent, and universally understood gesture, proving that sometimes the most binding agreements are those that pass directly between two pairs of eyes, carrying a weight of meaning that words alone could never hope to achieve. But if the shared labor agreement bound a community through collective sweat, the memory-object exchange created a bond that was intensely personal and heartbreakingly fragile. This was a contract that reached into the most private corners of a person's life, taking an object steeped in memory and identity and offering it as the ultimate collateral for a promise. Imagine a feudal knight about to swear lifelong allegiance to his liege lord. He could simply kneel and speak the words, but to make the vow truly unbreakable, he might also unfasten a battered silver locket from around his neck, a locket containing a portrait of his deceased mother, the only thing he carried from his homeland. As he placed this precious object into his lord's hands, he was doing something far more profound than giving a gift. He was offering a piece of his own history, his own heart, as a guarantee. The Lord, in accepting it, was accepting not just the man's military service, but the weight of his entire story, vowing to be worthy of such a devastatingly personal pledge. The power of this pact lay in its profound asymmetry. Unlike a simple token that might be crafted specifically for an agreement, a true memory object was inherently irreplaceable. Its value was not in its material worth, but in the invisible web of memories, loves, and losses it represented. A worn, smooth stone from the shore where a sailor's father taught him to swim, a faded ribbon from a bride's wedding gown, a child's first carved toy, these were the currencies of this most intimate form of contract. To give such an item was to say, I trust you with my past and therefore you can trust me with our future. The object itself became a powerful mnemonic device, a physical anchor for the memory of the promise. Every time the recipient looked upon it, they would be reminded not just of the agreement's terms, but of the depth of faith it took to hand it over. It made the contract emotionally unforgettable, ensuring it remained at the forefront of the mind long after the details might have otherwise faded. This practice was the bedrock of diplomacy in many tribal and feudal societies, where personal honor was the primary enforcement mechanism for law. Among the Celtic tribes of ancient Europe, the exchange of prized personal possessions often sealed treaties between chieftains. A leader might give his counterpart his favorite hunting dagger, its hilt worn smooth by his own grip, its blade having provided for his family for years. This was a pledge that carried the weight of his personal honor and his family's sustenance. In feudal Japan, a samurai pledging himself to a new master might present a treasured item, perhaps a fine piece of calligraphy written by his grandfather or a sword guard that saved his life in battle. The daimyo who accepted it understood the gravity of the gesture. He was now the guardian of the man's legacy. The consequences of betraying a pact sealed with a memory object were uniquely severe, striking at the emotional core rather than just the social standing. If the recipient of the object later broke the agreement, the insult was monumental. It wasn't just a breach of contract, it was a desecration of a sacred personal history. The original giver would be justified in feeling a grief as deep as if the object had been destroyed, because the trust invested in it had been. Conversely, if the giver of the object betrayed their vow, the recipient held a powerful tool for exacting social revenge. They could publicly return the object not with anger but with a sorrowful display that would utterly shatter the oath breaker's reputation. They might present it to the community elders, saying, "He gave me this, the memory of his mother, as his pledge. And see how he values her memory now." This public shaming was often a more devastating punishment than any fine or physical penalty, as it permanently marked the individual as someone who had betrayed not just a person, but their own past. The memory object exchange thus reveals a timeless human truth. The most powerful promises are those that are written not on paper, but on the heart, and sometimes we need a physical, tangible piece of someone's heart to hold them to it. But if a memory object anchored a promise in the tangible past, other ancient contracts sought to capture something far more elusive and transient, the very essence of a person's presence in the world. This brings us to the Shadow Pact, an agreement that used one of the most universal yet mysterious natural phenomena to seal a bond of shared destiny. In the bright light of the sun, your shadow is your constant, silent companion, a dark echo of your form that mimics your every move. To many ancient animistic cultures, this wasn't just an absence of light. It was a tangible part of your soul, your life force, your very being projected onto the earth. And so, the act of deliberately merging your shadow with another's was not a casual gesture. It was a profound act of spiritual fusion, a non-verbal contract that wove two fates into a single, inseparable thread. The power of this pact was rooted in a beautiful and widespread belief known as animism, the idea that everything in nature, rocks, rivers, trees, and even shadows, possesses a spirit or a conscious energy. In this worldview, a shadow wasn't an inert silhouette. It was an active, living extension of the self. In parts of West Africa and among certain indigenous cultures of the Americas and Oceania, this understanding was particularly potent. To bring your shadows together was to literally blend your spirits, creating a new, combined entity that represented your united purpose. This ritual was often employed at the most critical junctures. Two leaders of rival villages seeking to end a generations-long feud might meet at a designated time when the sun was low and their shadows were long. They would position themselves carefully, not looking at each other, but watching the ground until the dark outlines of their bodies flowed into one another, forming a single, amorphous shape on the earth. In that moment, the agreement was sealed. Their conflict was over, not because of negotiated terms, but because they had chosen to become, in a spiritual sense, one entity moving forward. This practice was also common in sealing romantic unions or deep friendship pacts, especially in Polynesian cultures. A couple might stand together at sunrise, their merged shadows stretching out before them towards the west, the direction of the setting sun and the ancestral afterlife. This was a powerful omen, symbolizing that their joined path would last their entire lives and continue even after death. The Shadow Pact was therefore a contract with an eternal dimension, linking individuals not just for the present but for all time. The consequence of breaking such an agreement was believed to be uniquely catastrophic. Since your shadow was a part of your soul, tearing it away from another's after they had been merged was a violent act of spiritual amputation. It was thought to leave a piece of your own essence fractured and lost, making you spiritually vulnerable forever after. The offender might be plagued by a sense of profound incompleteness, a lingering malaise, or a string of inexplicable misfortunes, all seen as the direct result of having shattered a bond that was meant to be as permanent as the soul itself. This ethereal contract demonstrates the incredible poetic imagination of our ancestors, who found in the simple play of light and darkness a powerful language for the most serious promises of unity and trust. After the Shadow Pact blended souls through a merging of darkness, some ancient cultures sought an even more direct and intimate fusion, one that used the very air we breathe to forge an unbreakable bond. This was the breath exchange ritual, a practice that recognized the simple, invisible act of respiration as the most fundamental proof of life itself. To share your breath with another was to offer them the most immediate and essential part of your being, creating a contract written not on stone or skin, but on the wind that passes between two people. The profound power of this pact stemmed from a near-universal ancient understanding. Breath is spirit. Across countless languages and cultures, the words for breath and spirit are deeply intertwined. The Latin spiritus means both breath and soul. The Greek pneuma carries the same dual meaning. In Hebrew, ruach signifies breath, wind, and spirit. This was not a linguistic coincidence but a reflection of a core philosophical observation. The moment a living being dies, the one thing that visibly and irreversibly leaves the body is its breath. Therefore, to willingly share your breath was to share the animating force of your soul, creating a connection that was meant to be as vital and permanent as life itself. We see this enacted with beautiful solemnity in the traditions of some Native American nations, particularly among the peoples of the Pacific Northwest. Here, the ritual often involved the sharing of a sacred pipe, but the true contract was sealed not in the smoke, but in the shared act of breathing. The pipe was lit, and the first puff of smoke was not inhaled by the person who lit it, but was instead blown gently into the face of the other participant. This was a deliberate and sacred offering. By blowing the smoke infused with the scent of sacred tobacco and your own breath onto the other person, you were enveloping them in your spirit. They, in turn, would then do the same for you. In that moment, your breaths and spirits mingled in the air between you, creating a spiritual kinship that was considered as strong as or even stronger than blood relation. This created a new set of responsibilities. You were now obligated to provide for this person as you would your own family, to protect them, and to share in their joys and sorrows. It was the ultimate expression of the phrase, "all my relations," extending the circle of kinship through a silent, smoky covenant. This concept of breath as a binding, spiritual force extended far across the Pacific Ocean into the islands of Polynesia. In Maori culture, the traditional greeting known as the hongi is a powerful and direct form of the breath exchange ritual. When two people press their noses and foreheads together, they are not simply touching heads. They are sharing ha, the breath of life, and mori, the life force itself. This greeting is reserved for the most significant occasions, such as welcoming visitors onto a marae, a sacred communal space, or at the conclusion of an important peace treaty. The hongi is the final seal on any agreement, transforming strangers into Tangata Wenua, people of the land, with shared rights and responsibilities. It signifies that the individuals are now of one breath and one mind, their individual life forces having been intermingled into a collective spirit. To engage in a hongi and then later betray that trust was considered a deep spiritual violation, a poisoning of the shared life force that could bring imbalance and misfortune to both parties. The consequences of breaking a breath-sealed pact were believed to operate on a metaphysical level. Since the agreement involved the literal blending of life forces, a violation was seen as a form of spiritual self-harm. The Maori believe that when you share ha, you create a familial bond. To harm someone you have greeted with a hongi is to harm a part of your own extended self, creating a hara, or a transgression, that disrupts your own spiritual well-being. Similarly, in Native American traditions, betraying a pact made through the pipe and the shared breath was believed to invite sickness, bad luck, and a restless spirit, as the harmony achieved during the ritual was shattered. The enforcement was internal and spiritual. The guilt and the cosmic imbalance were their own punishment. This intimate form of agreement stands as a stunning testament to the poetic insight of ancient cultures, who understood that the most powerful contracts are those that acknowledge our most basic human commonality, the simple, sacred act of drawing breath. After the intimate exchange of breath that blended spirits, we arrive at a contract that traded in something far more tangible, yet equally symbolic, the power of access itself. This was the Symbolic Key Handover, a ritual where a simple, often oversized or even purely ceremonial iron key became the ultimate embodiment of trust and responsibility. Imagine the heavy oak doors of a medieval castle, barred from the inside, representing the absolute security and autonomy of the lord within. For him to personally present the large, wrought iron key to those doors to another individual was an act of breathtaking vulnerability and faith. It was a non-verbal declaration that said, "I trust you with my safety, my wealth, and my home. The barriers I have built against the world I now lower for you." The power of this gesture lay in the universal language of the key. Its form and function were understood by everyone, from the highest noble to the lowest servant. A key locks and unlocks, it grants entry and denies it. It controls access to spaces of safety, privacy, and treasure. Therefore, to hand someone a key was to grant them a portion of your own control. This made it the perfect instrument for formalizing a huge range of agreements where a transfer of authority was required. In medieval Europe, the presentation of a key was central to the ceremony of granting a fiefdom. When a king invested a knight with a parcel of land, the physical handover of a key to the manor house or the local stronghold was the climactic moment of the ritual. This wasn't just about property, it was a transfer of duty. The knight was now responsible for the defense and administration of that land and its people. The key was the physical token of that weighty obligation, a constant reminder that his new authority came with immense responsibility to the crown. This practice flourished in the ancient world as well. In the Byzantine Empire, the appointment of a high-ranking official, such as the commander of the imperial guard, was often sealed with the presentation of a golden key. symbolizing his access to the innermost chambers of the palace and, by extension, to the emperor's person. In ancient China, during the Han Dynasty, a similar ritual existed for appointing city governors. They would receive a ceremonial key to the city gates, representing their new role as the guardian of the community's safety and the regulator of who entered and exited its walls. The key itself might not actually fit any lock. Its power was purely symbolic, which in many ways made it even more potent. Its value was not in its utility, but in the profound meaning everyone attached to it. It was a metaphor made metal, a promise you could hold in your hand. The consequences of betraying this specific form of trust were considered particularly heinous because it was a betrayal of granted access. The recipient of the key had been invited inside the circle of trust, often after careful vetting and ceremony. To abuse that access by stealing, spying, or unlocking the gates for an enemy was the ultimate act of treachery. It was a violation that felt like a personal insult as much as a political or military crime. In medieval legal codes, the punishment for such a betrayal was often extreme, frequently involving execution. This severe response was a necessary deterrent for a system that relied so heavily on these symbolic acts of faith. The social stigma was equally devastating. A person known to have betrayed a key handover pact was marked forever as the worst kind of oath breaker, someone who had exploited the very gesture of trust designed to create order and safety. Their name would become synonymous with perfidy, ensuring that no one would ever be foolish enough to grant them access, literal or metaphorical, ever again. This silent contract, sealed with cold iron or gleaming gold, proved that sometimes the greatest power is not in holding the keys yourself, but in knowing exactly who to give them to. Now imagine the air itself vibrating with the force of dozens of voices raised as one, a powerful wave of sound that doesn't just describe an agreement but physically enacts it through shared rhythm and harmony. This was the contract of the shared song or chant, a pact where melody became the medium and harmony became the binding force. In a world without recording devices or widespread literacy, music served as a living, breathing legal document, a way to encode complex terms into a form that was not only unforgettable but also required collective participation to bring to life. The very act of singing together created a powerful, physiological experience of unity, aligning the heartbeats and breaths of the participants, and in that aligned state, a promise was born that was far more durable than one merely spoken. The effectiveness of this contract lay in its brilliant use of music as a mnemonic technology. A lengthy treaty detailing land rights or a complex list of trade obligations could be difficult to remember verbatim, but set those same terms to a strong, repetitive melody with a clear rhythm, and they became indelible. The lyrics of the song became the clauses of the contract, and the act of singing them was the act of reaffirming them. We see this beautifully illustrated in the traditions of the Pacific Northwest indigenous peoples, particularly with the ceremonial potlatch songs. During a potlatch, a complex event involving the redistribution of wealth and the affirmation of status, specific songs were performed that detailed the history of the gifts, the names of the givers and receivers, and the specific obligations incurred. These weren't just performances, they were public, musical recordings of the event's legal and economic outcomes. Everyone who participated in the singing became a witness to the agreement, and the song itself would be passed down through generations, serving as an oral archive that could be referenced in future disputes. The melody acted as a mental filing system, ensuring that the precise terms of the pact would be remembered exactly as they were originally intended, without the drift that can occur in oral histories told only in prose. Beyond its function as memory aid, the shared song pact worked on a deeper, almost magical level of social bonding, singing or chanting in unison is a profoundly cohesive activity. Studies have shown that synchronized singing releases endorphins and oxytocin, creating feelings of pleasure and trust among the participants. Our ancient ancestors understood this effect intuitively. When two tribes met to form an alliance, negotiating the terms might take hours of tense discussion, but the final seal on the agreement was often the composition and performance of a new song together. As voices blended, any remaining sense of us versus them began to dissolve, replaced by the powerful feeling of a new we. The harmony they created with their voices became a metaphor for the harmony they sought to achieve in their relationship. This was especially potent in cultures like the Maori of New Zealand, whose waiata songs are integral to formal welcomes on the Maori meeting grounds. The act of singing together after a formal speech is not entertainment. It is the final, emotional ratification of the words that have been spoken, a way of bringing the entire group into alignment with the decision. The consequences of breaking a song-sealed pact were believed to be both social and spiritual. On a social level, to violate an agreement that had been formalized in song was to make yourself an outcast from the harmony of the community. You were quite literally singing out of tune with everyone else, but the belief often went further. Many cultures believed that the song itself held a kind of power. For the Navajo people, their ceremonial chants are not just songs. They are active, restorative forces that maintain balance and harmony in the world, known as hajo. To make a promise within the framework of such a chant and then break it was to disrupt that delicate balance, inviting illness, misfortune, or natural disaster. The song was the contract, and the melody was its sacred container. Breaking the promise shattered the container and released chaos. This idea that music could order the world and that breaking a musical pact could disorder it shows just how deeply our ancestors believed in the binding power of a shared melody. It was a contract that resonated not just in the ears of the participants, but in the very fabric of the universe they believed in. Now, imagine a meeting where there is no head of the table, no raised podium, and no single person holds the floor by right of position. Instead, everyone is arranged in a perfect ring, each face visible to all the others, every voice carrying the same inherent weight. This was the Circle Gathering Pact, a non-verbal contract that used the most fundamental geometry to enact a profound social ideal: absolute equality. In a world often dominated by hierarchies of strength, age, or birthright, the circle was a radical and deliberate act of leveling, a physical declaration that for the purpose of this gathering, every participant was an equally vital part of the whole. The power of this spatial agreement lay in its elegant, inescapable logic. A circle has no beginning and no end. It possesses no corners where power can accumulate and no sharp angles that create divisions. In the traditions of many Native American nations, this was the sole arrangement for a council fire. Elders, warriors, women, and men would all sit together on the ground, forming a living wheel where the leadership of the community was not vested in a single chief, but in the collective wisdom of the circle itself. This was far more than a seating preference. It was a sacred principle of governance. The talking stick or feather would be passed around the circle, and only the person holding it could speak. This simple tool enforced the contract, ensuring that each perspective was heard without interruption, and that the most soft-spoken member had the same right to contribute as the most charismatic orator. The circle physically prevented anyone from dominating the conversation simply by making it impossible for one person to be the visual focus for everyone else. Your audience was always beside you, not in front of you, fundamentally changing the dynamic from performance to partnership. This practice was equally vital to the Celtic cultures of ancient Europe, particularly among the Druids and the clans of Scotland and Ireland. Historical accounts suggest that important legal judgments and community decisions were made by groups of elders or brehons sitting in a circle, often atop a burial mound or within a stone ring. The circular formation was a direct reflection of their worldview, which saw the cosmos as an interconnected web of life, not a vertical ladder of power. In this circle, a young freeman with a valid point could theoretically hold as much sway as a seasoned chieftain, because the truth of the argument was meant to matter more than the status of the arga. The circle was a physical amplifier for meritocracy. A break in this circle was the most powerful non-verbal statement of dissent imaginable. If a respected member of the council, upon hearing a proposal, simply stood up and walked away, creating a gap in the ring, the discussion was often considered void. Their physical withdrawal was a silent veto, a stark visual representation that consensus had been broken and the collective spirit of the agreement had been fractured. This gave every single member a tangible, powerful tool to halt a decision they believed was deeply wrong, ensuring that no action could be taken without genuine, unified support. What makes the Circle Gathering Pact so enduringly relevant is its brilliant understanding of environmental psychology, how our physical surroundings shape our behavior and our thinking. The Circle is perhaps the most powerful architectural tool ever invented for fostering collaboration and muting hierarchy. Even today, we instinctively understand this. We sit in circles for support groups, team-building exercises, and kindergarten classes because we know it encourages openness and shared ownership. The ancient peoples who formalized this practice were master psychologists. They knew that by arranging their bodies in a ring, they were also arranging their minds towards a common purpose. This non-verbal contract required no oaths, no signed documents, and no exchanged tokens. The agreement was written in the very space between them, a shared commitment to listen, to respect, and to decide together, proving that sometimes the most powerful promises are not made with words or objects, but simply by choosing to sit down together as equals. What truly unites these 32 silent contracts, spanning continents and millennia, is their masterful use of a universal human language, the language of symbolism. Ancient peoples were master psychologists, intuitively understanding that a powerful symbol could communicate a complex idea more effectively than a paragraph of legal text. A shared drink wasn't just about quenching thirst, it was a symbol of internalizing a promise, of taking the terms of an agreement into one's very body. A handshake was a pantomime of peace, demonstrating empty hands and a willingness to connect as equals. The Salt Covenant used a precious, life-preserving commodity to symbolize the preservation of the relationship itself. These symbols worked because they tapped into deep, shared understandings that transcended spoken language. A farmer who spent his life coaxing food from the earth understood the profound commitment represented by breaking bread. A sailor who battled the unpredictable sea understood the steadfastness invoked by a hand clasp over water. By rooting their agreements in these universally grasped concepts, ancient societies created a contractual language that was both elegantly simple and incredibly robust, capable of conveying immense meaning through a single, potent gesture or object. This symbolic language was almost universally supercharged by a second powerful thread, the seamless integration of spiritual belief. In a world where divine forces were seen as active participants in daily life, making a contract without invoking them would have seemed naive and dangerously weak. Spiritual enforcement provided a deterrent that was far more potent than any earthly court could offer. When two parties swore an oath on a sacred stone, they weren't just asking the rock to remember, they were calling upon the eternal, unyielding power it represented to witness their vow and punish its breaking. The animal sacrifice covenant took this to its extreme, with the life of a valuable creature serving as the bloody premium paid for a divine insurance policy on the agreement's integrity. This belief system created a form of psychological enforcement that was omnipresent and inescapable. You might be able to hide a lie from your neighbor, but you could never hide it from the gods who witnessed your hand on the stone or your share of the sacrificial meal. This fear of cosmic retribution of plagues, failed harvests, or personal ruin was a powerful glue that held agreements together across vast distances and between strangers who might never meet again, providing a reliable foundation for trade and diplomacy in an otherwise uncertain world. The third common thread is the brilliant reliance on physicality to make abstract promises tangible and unforgettable. An agreement that exists only in the air between two people is fragile, easily forgotten, and simple to deny. But an agreement that you can feel, hold, or perform becomes undeniably real. The knot-tying agreement transformed a vow into a physical object you could keep in a pouch, its complex loops serving as a tactile reminder of each specific term. The footprint pact pressed the promise directly into the earth, using the unique mark of a person's body as their signature. The shared labor agreement wrote the contract in the shared sweat and fatigue of building a barn or harvesting a field, creating a muscular memory of obligation. This physical engagement made the commitment stick in a way that words alone could not. It required effort and intention to tie the knot, to press the foot, to swing the scythe, preventing impulsive promises and ensuring that the weight of the agreement was felt in the body, not just the mind. This turn to the tangible was a stroke of genius, leveraging our fundamental human need to interact with the physical world to create a system of trust that was durable, portable, and incredibly difficult to falsify. Ultimately, these 32 practices reveal a stunning picture of human ingenuity in the face of a universal challenge. Every society, regardless of its time or place, has needed to find ways to build trust, facilitate cooperation, and resolve conflicts. Without the crutch of widespread literacy or standardized legal codes, ancient peoples looked around them and innovated with what they had. They used the gestures of their hands, the objects of their daily lives, and the rituals of their spiritual practices to construct systems of agreement that were perfectly adapted to their environments and beliefs. The Vikings' hand clasp over water makes perfect sense for a culture defined by the sea. The Bedouins' salt covenant is a brilliant adaptation to the harsh economics of desert survival. The Incas' knotted quipu is a logical and sophisticated solution for administering an empire without an alphabet. By examining these common threads, we don't just see a collection of curious historical anecdotes. We see the deep architecture of human society being built, one silent, symbolic, and profoundly powerful agreement at